sure how, does this work for both of us? All right, lovely. Hello, hello, hello. It's lovely to be here and in conversation with Euge and Nicole. I feel very humbled because it's a great honor to be here sitting with Euge and Nicole. I admire his work very much. And because of that, I think we're going to have a discussion, of course, because there are rather miraculous points of intersection between our works and I think our imagination and our relationship also with other writers. But I would like to organize the discussion around L'Œuvre des Mères and around Eugène first and foremost. And then as we're speaking, we'll explore these points of intersection between our interests, our passions, and of course these writers which are Proust and Nabokov. And one of the things I'd like very much to talk about is how does one deal with the anxiety of influence. I remember a British journalist once telling me, well, the anxiety of influence runs several notches higher when you're dealing with someone like Nabokov or Proust, and of course that will be one of the main topics of our conversation. How can one be a writer when also your writing is continually a homage to another or other writers?
Well, I think in this instance, I would like to ask you this question, because it's so obvious to me that you've done almost a perilous work in weaving your own words with Nabokov. It took me some time to understand, to realize that in this book you constantly quote Nabokov, so that one feels in a way that your own sentences have been prepared so as to insert, without breaking any tonality, the fragments of the Nabokovian ecstatic prose.
Well, thank you. Yes, I think that it was indeed very perilous, especially, as you know, when Nabokovians and Proustians are very jealous about their author. All Nabokovians I've ever met have a very private, intimate, special relationship with Nabokov. They believe they have met him, they have dreams about him, they go to visit his grave, his statue, they have private, mysterious conversations with him. So yes, indeed, I was setting myself up for a whole lot of trouble. But to answer your question precisely with the language, I think we share a French publisher, Olivier Cohen, since I was born in Paris, even though I'm Iranian, and I was born into the French language. And Olivier told me a few months ago, oh, you know, at the end of the day, you were completely unconscious of what you were doing. Inconscient in French, which means really not aware of what you were up for. And it's true, I think, in order to write and pay homage fully as a young writer to an older, now dead writer, it doesn't just require admiration. It requires not just être inconscient, but also irreverence and a measure of disrespect. Il fallait le brusquer. I had to sort of punch him a bit now and then. I don't like him as a poet, for instance. I think he was a terrible poet. I'm not crazy about his Russian works. For instance, I secretly don't like Pale Fire very much. And the truth is, he hated women writers. So just even to be a woman writer, and this time you're going to write about and with Nabokov and sort of tango with him, required a lot of irreverence.
In a way, it has also to do with the genre of this book, because it's partly an autobiography. There are fragments of your life, fragments of his life, and all of a sudden you realize that it's none of these. You finally created a genre in a way. But I also want to come back to this point of anxiety of influence, which is, as you know, a very positive term, because Bloom explains the history of English poetry as an anxiety of influence. In the case of The Enchanter, what is very interesting to me is that you've done something in a way that Proust did when he made pastiche. He said that his pastiche were a kind of creative criticism. So your book is not about Nabokov, but it's not an essay on Nabokov, but it's in a way a lively way to say something about Nabokov by using his own words.
Yes, I very much wanted that, and Nabokov hated disquisitions. He didn't like la littérature d'idées, the literature of ideas. He thought he called it topical trash. And he wasn't very fond of most non-fiction. And I thought, when I started working on him, it was years ago when I was still a student in France, and initially I thought I wasn't going to do it. There were too many things had been done. And I went to see my professor, who was Pierre Pétillon, who's an Americanist at the Rue d'Ulm, and I told him, I want to work on Nabokov, but I'm not going to do it because everything has been done. He said, really? You start your career like that? Well, you're not going to do anything because everything has been done. And find your own way, girl. And because of this, thanks to him, I did try to find my own way. And yes, I wanted to do something that was a combination of fiction and essay, because the book had to be playful. Because in order to talk about Nabokov as the great writer of happiness, which had not been done before, I had to find the correct form. So in a way, you're absolutely right. It was as though I was constructing a framework to talk about Nabokov, but the framework, of course, I was hoping that if someone was going to an exhibition to see, say, paintings by Nabokov, well, they would be interested in the frame as well, because the frame would reveal something about the writer, so that it became extremely interactive in a sense, and as playful as possible. That's what I wanted. And I had gone to see Dmitry Nabokov in Switzerland a couple of years before getting started, asking him, I read so much about Lolita and about Ada, and nobody quite seems to get this angle. What do you think? And he said, yes, very much so. I think in so many ways he was the writer of happiness, and himself as an artist, he was very much the anti-romantic, and he was very much a happy man himself in relation to his wife, also in his stays in America and in Switzerland and so on. And then I spoke to Updike. I pretended I interviewed him for Le Monde, and then in fact, I mostly talked with him about Nabokov because he had written a wonderful piece in the New Yorker called "The Crunch of Happiness," and he too said yes. He is very much the writer of ecstasy. And once I had those two, in a sense, those two great men gave me the courage to embark on this perilous adventure, then I felt free. And I think that feeling freed from that fear and constraint and delving into a more creative endeavor, he himself called the reader, he said the reader should always be a creative reader, which is always reinventing the world as he's reading. But here I'd like to change the focus onto you. And before we start talking about the influence of Proust in your work and how you dealt with the anxiety of influence, I'd love for all our English speakers here who might not have read Euge and Nicole in French to read a beautiful translation of the very beginning of L'œuvre des Mères. So it's called The Epoch of Tello. May 20th, 1927, into the 12th hour of his historic flight, as recorded in his memoir, The Spirit of Saint Louis, Lindbergh looked out of the cockpit of his monoplane and saw the little French islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. He was seen passing overhead by a lone figure at the furthermost tip of the Savoyard Cove, a young woman gathering seeds on the well-worn slopes of the hill. She never, subsequently, quite managed to explain just what it was that she had felt when, confused by the sound of a motor overhead, she had lifted her eyes and followed the movement of this black dot through the air, ever growing larger. It took people a good while to understand that, ignorant as she was of the progress of aviation, and somewhat simple of mind, she had interpreted this scene in her own fashion and had described to the airplane the form of the only motorized vehicle with which she was familiar. Utterly astounded to have seen the brown Peugeot of Monsieur Tello up in the sky above, she made for Iphigénie Road and, out of breath, raced down the several kilometers of asphalt that led back to town. In front of the cemetery, she felt faint. Several hours later, she gave birth to a boy who, like her, soon proved to be simple-minded. Her name was Gabi, and his Clément, but because he was cross-eyed, people called him Coco Belleuil. In February 1929, the roadstead froze over. On April 14, 1930, in the Western Union offices of New York, the stream of telegraph suddenly came to a halt. One of the cables that conveyed the messages between the old and new world had snapped, dispatched to the waters off Newfoundland, where it was presumed the break had occurred. The SS Great Eastern II attempted for months to carry out the repair on the ocean floor without success. The company, which was already feeling the effects of the depression, let many of its operators go. Louise and Sophie were among the first to be fired. Upon their return to the island, they managed to find positions as cook and chambermaid at the residence of the governor de Cournette, whom they served with assiduity for a number of years. When Admiral Muselier occupied the archipelago as name of the Free French Navy in December 1941, they had retired to a tiny shanty facing the ancient building of the Œuvre des Mers. The translation is by Richard Sieber. Yes. So this brings me to first ask you, how did this adventure start for you? On the one hand, there is Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, which is a tiny island in the northern Atlantic, which I confess, before reading Eugène Nicole, I misplaced as well, apparently like most people. And Eugène has a beautiful sentence that he gave Le Monde in an interview last year. He said that writing was about dire cet endroit inconnu qui se trouve pourtant sur tous les planisphères. To say this unknown place, to tell this place that is yet, and that is, in fact, in spite of this, that however it occurs on all maps of the world, this unknown that is everywhere. What was the beginning of this adventure?
Well, it's a long story, of course, but I would say that, to make it short, I felt a responsibility to write about this place where I was born and where my ancestors had been living, which is not only unknown to the general public, but even to French people, and which had not, so to speak, entered French literature, although a few great writers have written a few pages about it. Chateaubriand, who in 1791 stopped in Saint-Pierre for 2 weeks on his way to America. Gobineau, who was at some point in charge of a transaction between France and England about the so-called North Shore for fishing rights, and Céline, who wrote one page, who went to Saint-Pierre for a few days in the 30s and has written one very, very funny page about Saint-Pierre. So this was my, as Proust would have said, my filiation noble. But to me, in a way, these people were strangers. And I would be the first, I am the first one to have written about Saint-Pierre. So it was an immense undertaking. I had to start. And the first problem that I had was that I had to name the islands, and I could not do it myself. I couldn't do it myself. It would have sounded false, because in Saint-Pierre we never say Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, of course. You are either on Saint-Pierre or on Miquelon, but Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon is an entity that we never speak about. So, fortunately, because there is chance in writing, one day I happened to find a copy of the Linder's memoirs, and there it was. I had my opening. A prologue in the sky. The islands were named by a foreigner, but in a moment, in a very important moment of contemporary history, the beginning of aviation and transatlantic flights, which were to play such a great role in my own life. And also between New York and Paris, which is in a way exactly how we could define Saint-Pierre. Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, I used to say it's like you know, the theologian who say that you cannot define God but only in negative terms. So Saint-Pierre is something that is neither American nor French. It's in between. It's in between. So this is how it started. And I remember that the image that I had in mind was to have the reader, to welcome the reader on a kind of inclined structure that came from the sea and brought the reader to the island and to the summit, actually, of the town, which happened to be the cemetery.
Well, I love this seminal idea of a nowhere that is everywhere and yet nowhere and unknown. I was, just when I started reading the book, I had read an article by or about Euge, which said most people can't place the island, and I thought to myself, wait a second, do I know? I've been to French school, and I thought it's in the Pacific, and I thought, then I read, well, no, everybody thinks it's in the Pacific, but it's not, and I thought it's near the Seychelles. And in fact, it turns out to be really close to Newfoundland, where I fly over, you know, every time I come to New York myself, where I live. So it's rather extraordinary, and to me, this is such a poetic idea. The sense that it's, in a way, it's almost Borgesian. This place that is and yet isn't, that is there and yet we don't know. So it's almost like it becomes an open, and both a place that is empty and that is full. It's both. It's like an open signifier, and it's such a poetic idea. It's such a poetic beginning for a work, for literary work.
To complicate matters about Saint-Pierre visibility, it must be added that it is the foggiest place on earth. So, we ourselves don't see ourselves here. But by a strange fit of memory, my only childhood recollections are recollections of beautiful weather. So yes, you have. We are dealing with island. Islanders things that nothing else exists in the world. And in my childhood, actually, the rest of the world didn't exist. You know, I could have drawn a map of the world a little bit like Steinberg did of New York. You know, there would be a little piece of France somewhere, but most of the map would have been Saint-Pierre, the map of the world. And so, while I keep progressing in my work, I rearrange this concept, these images of childhood. I learn about my own island, my native island. I read about it because in our childhood we knew nothing about it. We did not know our history, for example. It was not written. We knew a few legends. One of them was an incredible story, which has become a movie, actually. La Veuve de Saint-Pierre, the widow of Saint-Pierre. It's a story, it's the only capital execution in Saint-Pierre in 1889. And since there was no executioner, and the Monsieur de Paris, which is the title of the French executioner, would not, of course, make the trip. Somebody, a local person, had to do it, and it was a botched affair. But the incredible thing is that while the population wanted very much the death of this criminal, when the improvised executioner had done what he had done, he had become invisible for the rest of the population. Nobody would speak to him. Nobody would receive money from him, and he had to leave. And it's been used, this little story has been used as an argument against death punishment.
So another sentence that caught my attention, I read, or maybe it's actually, it might be by you, you said you feel very much like a writer of time inscribed in space. Now this writer in time inscribed in space brings us back to our forefathers and our literary forefathers. Do you feel, how did your interest in Proust conflate with your own writing? Was it there before? Did they grow together? How did this connection occur?
Well, fortunately for me, Proust's world is so far remote from an island in North Atlantic that I didn't have really to fear too much about it. But I learned something very important when I transcribed Proust's notebooks, and it was the importance of perseverance, the work that you had to do, and this was a model to me. And of course, here and there, I hide a few allusions, very cryptic allusions to Proust, and yes, it's from time to time, I could, like you did with Nabokov, I could read one of my sentences as a duplicate of a Proustian sentence in that. But I'm maybe the only one to know that.
Yes, it's true. It's a very, again, to go back to the first word used, it's a very perilous game, and yet it can be, I think it goes both ways, and almost three. In the context of, if you take American academia, if you were to duplicate a sentence, it would be called plagiarism. On the other hand, of course, all of literature, what has always interested me as a writer, and I'm now writing a novel, and my novel is very much about that in its own way, in a completely non-Nabokovian way. But all of literature, we seem to forget, especially in this 21st century, and perhaps in this academic context where we think that every duplication is plagiarism, we forget that all of literature is always a reinvention, is always a rewriting of texts that are already there. Shakespeare was rewriting. Shakespeare rewrote plays that already existed, that very much were exactly about the same topic, except he gave it his own twist. He took stories in the histories that existed. Homer, we know now, of course, that Homer probably didn't exist. At least there were at least two Homers, the Iliad and the Odyssey, being quote-unquote written, if they were written, or they were the work of multiple poets, and so on. But even the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey were stories that had been in oral tradition for years, perhaps for centuries. And that's something to me that is, I have a feeling that when one, and that's how I explain to myself, our weird fashion of putting, which actually you haven't, I don't think, have you? I think you did, I did see it. Yes, you did. When we always open books with one sentence by another writer, it's a symbolic way of paying tribute to the real nature of literature that is always rewriting, that's always reinvention.
Absolutely, it's the strata, it's something that is added to what you do, and it is a recognition, yes, that contrary to what I just said, you are never the first one, of course. You belong to affiliation, and you insert yourself into it. Sartre has described that very well, by at the same time imitating and revoking what has been done before. But since on this topic, something interested me in your work. For example, to imitate is there are two sides to imitation. One is, of course, repetition, but the other one is the constraints that they place on your own work. For example, I'm extremely interested in your work in the parallels, the parallelisms. For example, you have 14 chapters, and at some point you say that it's like speak memory, 14 chapters. These are frameworks, formal frameworks, that it's not really imitation. It's a constraint that you impose yourself on yourself, and you have to work on that. You add a dimension which is foreign to you, which comes from somewhere else, and which help you structure your work. At some point, these parallelisms in one of your chapters are very close to what the surrealists called hasard objectif. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I agree completely. And in fact, the way I construct my books, and the second one is very much this way as well, I always feel that architecture is first, really. Structure for me comes first. A book has to be, the charpente of the house has to be there. And then I feel that inside of each room, there's room for invention. I try not to construct too much ahead of time what will be inside of each room. But the charpente is there, the framework of the house is very much there. And yes, in this structure, there were many points of encounter, of encounter with Nabokov. Many things. There's a fake lexical, there's a lexicon, a sort of dictionary of Nabokovian words, and there are many games, as you just said, that are cryptic and that might be discovered by a very astute Nabokovian. He was born on April 23. He was obsessed with the numbers 423 because it was also Shakespeare's birthday. All the room numbers of the hotel, for instance, the hotels where Humbert and Lolita stay, are all variations on 423.
And your flight from Geneva to
Yes,
Paris.
of course. And all of a sudden, as a writer and the narrator of this sort of mad love story with a great dead writer, you begin to go slightly mad yourself. And I began to see 423s everywhere. I embarked the flight to Geneva. It was flight 423. I felt that it was as if Nabokov was beginning to speak to me, and I thought, God, I'm going as crazy as all the others who are speaking to him in their dreams. But yes, the hasard objectif is a very important element. I felt my very last chapter is a playful combination of words from him and me, because my book is constructed in a way that it starts in reality. It's me, Lila, a reader of Nabokov, a bit of a maniac, but a reader, and slowly it lifts off into fantasy as I want to pay homage to him.
A reluctant reader.
Even a reluctant reader, of course. I keep on falling asleep because it's so difficult. And life is so rich that reading is of course, seems almost tedious and comes at a great price for someone who loves life. So I'm a reluctant reader in the beginning and slowly construct this a lift-off into fantasy to pay tribute to what fiction does to you. Fiction really transforms the reader in a way that, to parody something that Nabokov says, he said, Ada is the feminine to the X degree. I would say that in the Nabokovian world, for the Nabokovian reader, imagination is reality to the X degree. So what happens in the last chapter, and you're absolutely right to call it hasard objectif, is that I mixed expressions of light, because to me really the secret of Nabokov, and I've only seen this in Homer, is that he's very much the writer of light, and light becomes a continual metaphor for the ecstasy of being in the world. So I got all these light expressions, and I constructed a sentence where me, who was the reader in the beginning, then became the dreamer, the liar, the reader becomes a bit of a megalomaniac, and in a way, in the end, by combining through a complete, it was very random, and I left it that way, and it was a game of hasard objectif. I mixed our words, and in a way, the reader begins to supplant the writer and becomes herself the writer by reusing his words and rewriting a fictional story where one last time she meets Nabokov in a garage. So I'll just read one page, one paragraph of that. Light, noun, the medium of choice for netting the marvel of being in the world. One night in early March, I had a see-through vision of sun-spangled water parted by a mesh of sunshine. When I woke up, the slats of a Venetian blind had already striped 2 feet lazily reaching out of a twin bed. Icicles gloriously burned in the low sun, and I watched the droplets of water trickling down behind the slats while the sun broke into geometrical gems. I pulled up the blinds and admired the first sea of sun-shot greenery I had seen since the last days of my slow summer. The sky above formed a lucid turquoise space, and the receding cold ruffled with the first brilliant convulsions of spring. An unusual euphoria of lightness had set in. I rushed downstairs and stepped with naked soles on the freezing, sun-mottled bricks. Within seconds, the sky darkened, the poplars floated in a dusk-mellowed light, a blackbird sang a quavering trill, and sealskin-lined scarlet skies threatened the last beaming vestige of sunlight. I tiptoed toward the garage. The moth-flaked porch light exuded a warm haze. A lonely glowworm writhed around a stone slab. Fireflies flickered and vanished like golden ghouls of the passing fancies of the garden. The garage door looked farther and farther away from the arabesques of lighted window shining against the flow of night. The glass panes, for a moment it seemed as though someone had laid out magical lumps of calcium carbide, knowingly pointing the way to the garage door. The glass panes over the door radiated with a selenium glow. Then light collapsed. I approached him. He was writing neatly on a small white card propped up in a shoebox. I noticed the sudden radiance of a lone lamp. By his foot lay an emerald lantern, and in that arena of radiance he peered at me over his glasses, which had acquired the translucent green tone of grapes. He smiled like a sphinx. Was it the bright layer of madness? Ah, here you are. I have been waiting for you. I thought you might not come. His pallor shone, his blackness blazed in the scaly light. I opened my mouth and said nothing, gaping instead at the tender, moist gleam in the lower eyelid. So, one thing, of course, that we need to talk about is language, because we both come from a place where the choice of language, maybe for you in the beginning it was natural, but not completely, because you mentioned at some point that for your school friends, French seemed to be always problematic. Yet for you it wasn't. How did you find your place in the French language?
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yes, my colleagues at school didn't like French. I mean, it was hard for them, and for me it was like water. We were in a place, we were surrounded by English language. We did not speak English, as you can hear. I think I've always been reluctant about English in a way. But it was extremely important. At times I say that, in fact, what I have done is about the French language. I even said once to an interviewer that, yes, all of a sudden you make me think that, yes, my mother was a French language. Exactly. So it has to do with exile, if you wish, in a way. Because we were in France, but far away from France. And I always have this dual image of being far away and at the same time exactly where I was. This is an image that I always have when I write. Exile is a complicated affair. It's not that you feel that you are away, but you feel that you are away and at the same time you are where you used to be. And this is an experience I felt extremely strongly, of course, when I was 14, I found myself in a dormitory in a private school in France, because at the time there was no high school in Saint-Pierre, and I had to leave everything to continue my studies. So this dimension, yes, of focusing from far away, if I could say this, focusing from far away, is certainly it's an image, of course, but it explains a lot about, I think, what I try to do. It's a novel. It's not an autobiography. The most important character is the island, but the island in all its aspects. There are about 100 characters in the book. All of them, of course, have a key. They have originated in people I knew, At some point, I even kept their real names, which was, of course, a source of big trouble for me, especially with my family. But fortunately, the book was reissued a number of times, and then I have changed the names again, but it was too late. Obviously, it didn't repair the damages that I had done. But I felt in a few instances, this question of naming is absolutely central to writing, I think. In a few instances, for example, about my aunts, I could not have imagined to give them fictitious names. Although, again, it was a mistake.
Yeah.
There is something extremely sensitive about our relationship to naming. In other instances, of course, I invented names. But there are about 100 characters. It's full of invented events. You have a schoolmaster who thinks that he is Jacques Cartier.
Jacques Cartier, who discovered Saint-Pierre in 1535?
35, yes, on his way back from Canada. The same person pretends to have in his house a room in which you have ancient snows framed like paintings with the dates, etc., etc. So there is an amount of magic, poetry, the way I see it, but also very factual things. For example, along the plot, there are bird watchers, for example, who spot new species in contradiction to there is a store whose name, Newfoundland Stores, has been written with letters taken from shipwrecks, and the letters fall little by little, and at the end there is nothing, etc. So you have these dimensions, these themes which go all along the narrative and which play like units of time. Time is, of course, extremely important.
Well, that was actually, it's one of the great questions, and that's what ties you way beyond influence or admiration or the love of Proust. It's what ties you very much to Proust is being yourself and the narrator of something, of a work that could have been an autobiography, and yet is a novel, and the novel becomes an extraordinarily rich signifier, far richer than if you had written an autobiography. And I wonder, was it always absolutely clear for you that it was going to be a novel? Was there a point of hesitation? How did you place your first foot in the land of fiction?
Yes. I think, yes, my initial idea was that it would be a novel. Actually, it becomes more and more autobiographical. It certainly is more autobiographical when I leave the islands, of course, because then I have to speak about myself, but without forgetting the islands. But yes, there are a number of processes that go toward fiction and toward reality, and they crisscross, and etc.
And your sentence also, that we were still talking about the cryptic Proust. I think Proust has a very sinuous sentence. Your sentence is less sinuous, but it certainly radiates in a peculiar way that seems to belong only to you. How do you go about the craft of your writing? Do you rewrite a lot? How does it work for you?
It's a tremendous amount of work. But I remember at some point I used to work on big units, units of 100 pages. So I had to place the voice at the beginning high enough so that it could encompass the entire 100 page. That's an image again, but Something else that I could say about these long sentences is that I try to give as much information as possible in each sentence.
Yes, there's great, great attention for detail, remarkable attention for detail.
For example, but that's the childhood memory, of course. For a child, I mean, 1 centimeter of asphalt, for example, is a word, and I describe at times, you know, a little piece of asphalt with all the changes that happen when it rains or when a car passes and there is a gasoline drop, etc., etc. So, yeah, you could write a novel about Nabokov does it.
I was going to say, in this you sound almost more Nabokovian than Proustian, and what you described would be something that could have been said, a sentence that could have been uttered by Nabokov.
Yes.
Very much so, about a centimeter of asphalt becoming a world and gleaming in its own particular way.
But let's go back to your own work for the wine. Nabokov said that you cannot read a book, you only reread the book. And in a way, I would say this is also something that could be applied to your writing. It's a rewriting, it's a rereading.
It's true, and it is. I also rewrite very, very much, and then of course there's a question that we're just talking about of language. There was a real question that posed itself to me as an exile, in a way that's another one of those miraculous points of encounter between our two bodies of work, is that, I mean, your body of work and my first work, I'm an exile as well because my parents were from Iran. I was born by accident in Paris shortly before the Islamic Revolution. I went back to Iran, and then the revolution happened, all hell broke loose for many people around us, and we left. And then when I started writing in French originally, and then I switched to English, and already English, there are many reasons why I switched to English, because I felt precisely perhaps that for me, as somebody who had grown up in the French language, I felt the French language was a straitjacket for me. It was the opposite of you feeling like a fish in water. I felt that Racine and Corneille were looking at me with a frown if I was trying to construct a sentence that was coming out of the strictures of the 17th century French language. I feel very much like French. And that's why I admire truly and genuinely contemporary writers who are able to break out of the French and make it their own. I feel French is a language that's more difficult to master because it is still, I think, a classical language, and the syntax of it is more I don't want to say rigid, but the syntax is more firm. In English, you can do things that are remarkable. You can, with verbs and preposition, you can say to write yourself into unhappiness, for instance, which you could never say in a Romance language. To hire unto a steamer, unto or on, you know, and with these prepositions, you can therefore create, invent, reinvent an idiom and have a great deal of elasticity. And what really fascinated me about English was the enormous amount of the vocabulary, because the French were very rigorous since the 17th century about not letting foreign languages enter into the French language the same way it is.
2,000 words in Racine.
2,000, really?
That's it. Of course, you're not supposed to sit down, so there is no chair. There are no objects. It's the vocabulary is only psychological. It has to do with passion, that's all. There is no table.
Beautiful, but exactly. And English, on the contrary, I finally asked a linguist friend of mine, I said, I am going crazy. I've been learning English for 20 years. I started very early on in adolescence. Why is it that I open Cormac McCarthy and there's 15 words I don't understand sometimes on every page? And he said, oh, that's because the English, the Brits already, and of course the Americans, just borrowed constantly from Japanese, from native Indian languages, from Latin, French, and Middle French. They borrowed several times the same word, making its way up to the English language. So that was, I think, the challenge, the excitement, and also precisely to free myself of being that careful student, the rewriter of French texts. I just opened a new text in English, in a sense.
yeah, actually your interest for English words and beautiful words and rare words, which are often actually from Latin vocabulary, is very well illustrated in chapter 13 of The Enchanter. Would you read the? I find it's really interesting the words that you have chosen here.
Well, we have a few words like say stratagem, which is, of course, everyone knows what it means, but it takes a foreign, again, it takes a foreign ear to hear in English something that perhaps a native speaker wouldn't hear. And the way that Nabokov hears stratagem is a gem in a strata. So he says in Nikolai Gogol, which is a wonderful book, I encourage you to read if you haven't yet, the interest that perfect strangers showed in regard to him seemed alive with dark stratagems and incalculable dangers. Beautiful words, stratagem, a treasure in a cave. So I said, calls forth strategically hidden treasures of other caves. Bear cat, of course these things mean completely, but bear cat sounds like a large feline. Isinglass, which is I think a form of bacteria, a bee frozen in crystal, or something else actually. Zugli is a bacteria, zugli, a happy experience in a cage. So there's a sense of always being defamiliarized with a tongue that is yours and never yours.
Yeah. Well, this is also the main poetic device, which, as we know, linguists have told us that language is arbitrary, unfortunately. But for the poet, it is not. And when Nabokov or you define a word with alliteration that make it sound as if it was connected with...
Because you said at one point, you say that you're not going back anymore to Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon.
X-Island, 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 X-Island. No, I don't go very often, first of all because I travel mostly between New York and Paris, and you know, when you have two places, it's also not so easy to reach. It is much easier to reach than it used to be when I was a student. Because, as I said, it's the farthest place in the world, so you reach it from Canada, obviously, Sydney or Halifax.
With a plane?
With the plane, because the progress is paradoxical. In the 19th century, the boats, the travel between France and Saint-Pierre was extremely easy. You had hundreds of boats all the time. Today there is only one boat. And the planes, of course, are subjected to problems that boats do not have, such as the fog. So I remember when I was coming back from France for the summer, I would be stuck at times 10 days in horrible Sydney, Nova Scotia, at the door of the paradise, and I had to wait for the fog to lift. So Saint-Pierre is still a faraway place that is not so easy to reach, but at the same time it has become like everywhere else in the world. And I register the progress, this uniformization. All of a sudden I come back from the other island where there is no electricity, and I come back to Saint-Pierre at night when, as I did when I was a child, and all of a sudden I see the white light that is everywhere in the world where workers work in factories and things like that.
And one thing that really caught my attention was when you said, you write at one point that you've lived out this space almost through your writing, and it's as though you didn't need to go back because it has been written already. Is there really, I want to say it in French, un épuisement? Does one write something away, or does it continue to exist in another form?
Well, at first, the problem that I experienced was that there was nothing to say. So it was an emptiness. And I have managed to make it a 1,000-page book, so, and I'm working on a continuation of it. writing creates writing. Fiction creates fiction. And in a way, our situations are inverted, at least as far as Nabokov was concerned. Now you're writing a novel. You had a gigantic mass of text in front of you, and you had to make selections in it, and to weave it into your own writing. I had nothing. I mean, I had the sea, but the sea is not made of words, as you know. So that is the big problem. You have to naturalize it into a literary form.
Yeah,
but it was an exciting experience for me.
I love what you say about the sea and having that empty form. It reminds me, there's a beautiful text by Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, and he writes about Bartleby, Melville, and he has a wonderful essay called, I think in French it's called Barthélemy, la formule de puissance, the formula for power, and he talks about that. He says, I prefer not to. It's an empty formula, but that becomes a formula for creation because it's an empty formula. What happened? What's going on? I prefer not to. Why is that so powerful? And what is at stake? What is at play? What happens when we have that it's almost like a circle that keeps on going round and round and round and opens completely the way for our imagination. And I feel very much that the way you talk about the island becomes une formule de puissance as well, because it was an emptiness that then slowly you reconstruct it through work.
World, this is very important, of course. It's nothing. It's I should say nothing. It's almost nothing. But of course, everything is in the almost.
And I do feel that in order to embark in fiction, I have to put Nabokov in a closet, and I have now locked him at the Tour in a cupboard. And the new book, in fact, I'm trying very much for the English that used to be a happy contagion of these luminous, light Nabokovian words. I want the contagion is now over. It will never be completely over. But I remember a medieval poet in Arabic who used to say that in order to become a great poet of the Arabic language, you had to learn thousands and thousands of poems, perhaps know parts of the Quran by heart, and then you had to forget. You had to forget. And of course, one never completely forgets. Il y a trop de choses qui affleurent, things that come back. They're always there. You continue to be a carrier of the virus, but the virus is dormant. And I feel very much as to join what you're saying, that in order to fully enter fiction, there's always this notion of reinvention. There's always a notion of a contagion, and yet somehow you have to leave it behind and just look at the void.
Yes, and you have to remain ecstatic about your writing. As Nabokov said, and it's very tediousness, is ennui, the fact that we add one book to billions of books already written. So there must be something that drives you.
I agree. I feel that when one enters, one of my favorite questions that I always try to pose at one point to writers, so I will pose it to you as well, is how many do you work every hour, every day? How many hours do you work? And I feel Virginia Woolf, for instance, used to work 3 hours a day. John Updike said he worked 4.5 every day. He told me, well, I was like a stockbroker, I have my hours. And I felt in the beginning, when I worked on this book, I set myself 5 hours because I thought, I'm no John Updike, I should work more. So I took 4.5 to 5. And in the beginning, you want to do everything else. You want to look at your email, you want to run around, you want to eat chocolate. And then I feel that I felt that my heartbeat getting slower, almost like a marine mammal, under the sea. And then I forgot about time completely. How does it work for you?
It really has to do with where I am in the book. Beginnings are, it's Salvador Dali, so to speak, by your own work, and then you work even while sleeping, while asleep. And then it has happened that some of my dreams have given me the keys that I was desperately looking for the night before. But so I don't make myself an agenda, a precise agenda about writing it.
And it's wonderful that your work is it continues. It's a never in a way that too is something quite original and unique. It just continues. It's a presque une œuvre ouverte. I mean, it's an open work.
It is an open work. The island is the center, but I'm away. I come back. I go around. Now I am in the sea because I find it extremely very interesting that we exist because of cod. Now today there is no more cod.
Maybe not even in Japanese restaurants.
Perhaps, but where does it come from? I'm not sure. But under the cod, there was gas and petroleum, and that's now what they're looking for. So my next work is called Territorial Waters, and it has to do actually with a terrible blow that was given to our territorial waters after a conflict with Canada. And we were given something terribly, terribly small, and so territorial waters. It's all territorial.
And to finish, I'll say that for Euge Nicole, his Madeleine, his Proustian Madeleine, is actually cod. Thank you so much.